Hello bachcho, let's see passage 1. It talks about France. Part 2, decarbonization is not now mapped out. The levers on which to pull have been identified. Everyone will have to contribute to the collective effort to reduce greenhouse gases. Main emitting sectors that are transport, agriculture, industry, construction and energy. The goal is to drastically reduce the overall volume of CO2 emissions by 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2015. The task is enormous. An action plan is to be finalized by the end of the June to specify how the necessary revolution will be carried out. But while the course has been set, the question of financing remains. Massive electrification and decarbonization of production, upheavals in mobility and lifestyle, and consumption of reduction erodes will represent colossal economic and social cost. Not only will have to pay for the investments necessary to achieve carbon neutrality, but will also have to compensate for the losses of tax revenue due to the economic shutdown it will cause. The reduction of brown expenditures. Brown expenditures क्या होते हैं? Let's see further. That is those that encourage the consumption of fossil fuels. Will not be sufficient to finance the transition towards the carbon neutrality. An increase in debt seems inevitable, but our current level of debt and the rise in interest rate, there is little room for maneuver. That leaves the fiscal lever. Here again, the country has already used up most of its ammunition by having the highest tax rate in the world, despite the tax cuts of recent years. At this stage, encouraged by its result, the government refuses to depart from its supply side policy, which consists of lifting the tax and regulatory breaks. However, this stance will increasingly difficult to maintain. On the one hand, the sum to be invested are astronomical. On the other hand, as Jean Pisani Ferry points out, the transition is spontaneously unequal. CO2 emissions are largely a function of income, yet one of the conditions for the success of transition is a social justice dimension. सोशल जस्टिस डायमेंशन का होना भी बहुत ज़रूरी है when we are talking about the transition from the CO2. From this point of view, progressive taxation is undoubtedly the best tool to achieve this. A progressive taxation is the only best tool to achieve such policies. Let's see the questions now. Question number 1 talks about which of the following statement is logical conclusion based on the information provided in the passage. तो हमें पैसेज से हम क्या कंक्लूड कर सकते हैं ये हमें बताना है. लेट्स सी द 4 ऑप्शंस. ए सेज द फ्रेंच गवर्नमेंट शुड इम्प्लीमेंट अ सप्लाई साइड पॉलिसी टू ओवरकम द फाइनेंशियल challenges of decarbonization. The passage nowhere explicitly mentioned that there should be implement of supply side policy to overcome the financial challenges of decarbonization, and hence this is a wrong conclusion. B says increasing tax on high income individual is the most effective method to achieve social justice in the transition of carbon neutrality. This is again a wrong option, because in one side the passage do talk about the progressive taxation, but per se it does not focus on whether increasing taxes on high income individuals will effective method to achieve the social justice or not, and hence cannot be directly concluded from the passage. C says France's current level of debt and rising interest will severely limit the country's ability to finance the necessary investments for decarbonization. This is a right option, because passage does talk about the current level of debt and the rising interest rate, and one of the second highest rate of interest, which is maneuvering the uh, ability of the government to have any further investments for the project. D says the reduction of ground expenditure alone will be sufficient to finance the France government transition to carbon neutrality. Again a wrong option, because the passage clearly states that such reduction will not be sufficient alone. Let's see the question number 2. It says which of the following statement is supported by the information provided in the passage. So we need to find a supporting statement. Let's see the options. A says France has exhausted most of its fiscal options and is unable to finance the transition towards carbon neutrality. This is not supported by the passage, because passage does talk about the limitations and the challenges in acquiring the finance, but it does not mention anywhere that it has exhausted most of its fiscal options per se. So let's find out which is the best option. B says the government supply side policy has effectively reduced CO2 emissions and will continue to do so in the future. This is again a wrong option, because no evidence of such reduction of CO2 has been presented in the passage. C says progressive taxation is a good tool to achieve social justice in the transition to carbon neutrality. This is a right option, because the passage do talk about how social justice is important if we want to achieve the carbon neutrality, and it is only possible through the progressive taxation, and hence C is the right option. D says reduction in brown expenditure alone will be sufficient. Again a wrong option, because the passage talks about quite opposite, which says it alone will not be sufficient. Let's see question number 3. It talks about in the light of the passage which of the following can be inferred. अभी inference question है. Let's see the option. A says France's ambitious decarbonization goals are unlikely to be achieved by 2030 due to the financial challenges involved. This is a wrong option for and cannot be inferred from the passage, because passage does talk about the financial challenges which the France can face, but it does not anywhere says that by 2030 the France will not be able to achieve its aim, and hence this is a wrong option. B says the France government supply side policy of lifting taxation and regulatory brakes has been successful in reducing CO2 emissions. Again, this is a wrong option, because there is no evidence of such reduction of CO2. Let's see this third option. The transition from carbon neutrality in France will must require a combination of increased taxation and progressive taxation. This is again a wrong option, because we have seen that passage does talk about the progressive taxation, but a combination of progressive taxation with increased taxation as a tool for carbon neutrality has not been discussed in the passage. Lastly, D says the economic slowdown caused by the transition towards carbon neutrality will lead to a decrease in the tax revenue for the French government. This is a right option, because in the passage it does talk about how massive investment will be required when we talk about the carbon neutralization, and how the same will reduce the tax, and hence causing both the things. Let's and hence it can be inferred from the passage. Let's see the fourth question. It talks about based on the information provided in the passage which of the following assumption is most likely to be true. हमें बताने कि कौन सा assumption चारों में से most likely है कि सही होगा. So let's see the options. A says the French government will prioritize investments in the energy sector over other sector to achieve carbon neutrality. This is a wrong option, because the passage nowhere mentions that the French government will prioritize the investment in energy sector, but instead it mentions that there should be a overall development of the sectors if you want to achieve the carbon neutrality. B says the economic and social costs associated with the transition towards carbon neutrality will outweigh the benefits in the long run. This is again a wrong option, because the passage does not provide enough information to decide whether the economic and social cost uh, will be outweighed in the long run. It is majorly focused on the financial challenges which will be required during this transition. C says the action plan to be finalized by the end of the June will address financial challenges and provide concrete solution for funding the transition. This is a right option, because given in the passage we have seen that an action plan will be available in June, and if we say so, we can assume that the action plan will contain the answers to all the financial challenges and how concrete the structure will be. So C can be assumed easily, and hence is a right option as of now. D says the French government will implement strict regulation and penalties to enforce reductions in CO2 emissions. This is again a wrong option, because it cannot be assumed in the present circumstance, where the passage clearly only is limited to the financial challenges and uh, no aspects of the French government being implementing strict regulations or penalties is being discussed. Let's see the last question of this passage. Fifth question is, which of the following statement, if true, would strengthen the argument? अब हमें बताना है कि कौन सा statement out of the four can strengthen the argument that the progressive taxation is the best tool to achieve social justice and France's transition towards carbon neutrality. So let's see the options. A says studies have shown that the countries have implemented progressive taxation has successful in reducing income inequality. This is a wrong option, but because it talks about progressive taxation reducing the inequality without focusing on the social inequality being reduced, which is required for the carbon neutrality. B says progressive taxation has been proven to generate substantial revenue for government investments in sustainable infrastructure and renewable energy. Option number B is again a wrong option, because although these investments and the revenues will be good in raising the finances, but it nowhere talks about the social justice which is being required in the case of carbon neutrality. C talks about the public opinion poll indicate that the majority of French citizens support the implementation of progressive taxation in order to fund the transition towards carbon neutrality. This option is again a wrong option, because it talks about the public opinion and is nowhere focusing on the social justice required. D talks about the experts in environmental economics argue that the progressive taxation provides a more equitable distribution of the financial burden associated with reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. This is a right option because it gives emphasis to the experts who are in the environmental economic, and it talks about the equitable distribution of financial burden which will create a social justice, or reduce the inequality in the uh, society, making D a right option. So I hope the passage was understandable. All the best.